November 9, 1989. The world watched as sledgehammers crashed against the Berlin Wall, each strike sending fragments of concrete into the night air like pieces of a broken promise. Young Germans, who had lived their entire lives divided, embraced strangers through gaps in the barrier. Western reporters wept on camera. The Cold War, that 44-year nightmare of nuclear terror and ideological warfare, was ending not with an explosion, but with champagne and tears. Yet among the jubilant crowds, few remembered the document. Buried in British archives since July 1945, stamped with classifications so severe that even mentioning its existence was grounds for prosecution, lay a military plan titled Operation Unthinkable. Its author was not some paranoid intelligence analyst or fringe politician. It was Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, the methodical British commander who had broken Rommel at El Alamein, orchestrated D-Day's ground operations, and accepted Germany's surrender. The plan's purpose was singular and terrifying. A total war against the Soviet Union, to begin on July 1, 1945, less than 2 months after Germany's defeat. Churchill had requested it. Montgomery had drafted it. Eisenhower had quietly ensured it never saw daylight. As the Berlin Wall fell, historians began asking the question that still haunts military academies and think tanks today. If they had listened to Montgomery, if they had launched Operation Unthinkable when the West held every advantage, would those 44 years of suffering have been necessary at all? Or would the world have burned in a nuclear dawn that made Hiroshima look merciful? The answer remains locked somewhere between what happened and what might have been. But to understand why Montgomery drafted a plan for World War III before World War II had even cooled, you have to go back to the spring of 1945, when victory felt inevitable but the future looked like fog. April 30, 1945. Adolf Hitler put a bullet in his brain in a bunker beneath Berlin. Within days, German forces across Europe began surrendering in chaotic waves. The war that had consumed 50 million lives was ending. In London, preparations began for the largest celebration in British history. In Washington, planners discussed troop demobilization and the shift to a peacetime economy. In Moscow, Stalin watched the map of Europe and made his own calculations. And in a command tent in northern Germany, Bernard Montgomery stood over that same map, tracing Soviet positions with his finger, and felt something he had not felt since the dark days of 1940. Dread. Montgomery was not a man given to panic or speculation. His nickname, Monty, suggested a friendliness he never possessed. Subordinates described him as cold, meticulous, even insufferable in his precision. He planned battles the way architects designed cathedrals, every brick accounted for, every angle calculated. His nickname among his own staff was less flattering. They called him the Field Marshal of Caution. But caution had won him North Africa. Caution had taken him through France. And caution was now screaming at him that the Soviets were not stopping. He had watched Soviet behavior through the final months of the war with growing alarm. At first, like most Allied commanders, he had admired the Red Army's ferocity. They had bled the Wehrmacht white on the Eastern Front, suffering casualties so catastrophic that British intelligence struggled to confirm the numbers. 20 million Soviet citizens dead. Perhaps more. Cities erased. Villages depopulated. It was suffering on a scale that made the Western Front seem almost manageable by comparison. But Montgomery noticed something else in those final months. The Soviets were not liberating territory. They were occupying it. When British forces entered a town, they distributed food, established local governance, and moved on. When Soviet forces entered a town, they stripped it. Factories were dismantled, machinery loaded onto trains heading east. Local governments were replaced with Soviet commissars. Elections, when they were held, were theater. The results were known before the ballots were printed. And anyone who protested disappeared. Montgomery began compiling reports from forward intelligence units. The pattern was undeniable. In Poland, the Soviets had allowed the Warsaw Uprising to be crushed by the Germans, waiting until resistance forces were slaughtered before moving in to claim a city emptied of opposition. In Romania, King Michael had switched sides to join the Allies, only to find Soviet troops occupying his capital and installing a puppet regime. In Czechoslovakia, a democratic government that had welcomed Soviet liberation was now being quietly dismantled from within. By late April, Montgomery's concerns reached Winston Churchill, who had his own suspicions about Soviet intentions. On May 10, 1945, 2 days after VE Day, Churchill sent a telegram to the British Chiefs of Staff. The message was brief and chilling. What would be the military consequences of a conflict with the Soviet Union? He wanted options. He wanted timelines. He wanted to know if the unthinkable could be thought. Montgomery received the order on May 14. The task was presented to him not as a serious war plan but as a contingency exercise. Britain had always prepared for unlikely scenarios. This, he was told, was simply prudent planning. Montgomery understood what was really being asked. If we have to fight them, can we win? And more importantly, if we are going to fight them, when is the best time? He assembled a small team, sworn to absolute secrecy. No secretaries. No clerks. Just senior planners with access to the most classified intelligence assessments available. They began with the most fundamental question. What would Soviet strategy be in a conflict with the West? The answer came quickly. The Soviets would not wait for the West to mobilize. They would strike immediately, flooding through Germany, the Low Countries, and into France before American reinforcements could cross the Atlantic. Their advantage was numerical. The Red Army in Europe numbered over 300 divisions, battered but operational, hardened by 4 years of total war. Against them, the Western Allies had perhaps 50 full-strength divisions, many already scheduled for demobilization. American public opinion demanded that soldiers return home. British forces were exhausted, their economy shattered. Canada and the Commonwealth nations were already drawing down troop levels. Montgomery's team ran the simulation. If the Soviets attacked, they would reach the French coast within 30 days. Britain would be isolated, facing a hostile continent for the third time in a century. Nuclear weapons were not yet a factor. The Americans had tested their first atomic device in secret, but operational weapons would not be available for months. If war came in the summer of 1945, it would be conventional, brutal, and decided by whoever controlled the continent. But then Montgomery's team considered the reverse scenario. What if the West struck first? What if, instead of waiting for demobilization, for Soviet consolidation of power, for the inevitable clash that both Churchill and Montgomery believed was coming, the Allies attacked now, while the Red Army was overextended, undersupplied, and still bleeding from the German War? The plan that emerged was codenamed Operation Unthinkable. The name was not ironic. It was a warning. The plan called for a coordinated offensive, beginning July 1, 1945. American, British, and Commonwealth forces, supplemented by rearmed German divisions, yes, German divisions, would strike east from occupied Germany. The objectives were not Moscow or total Soviet collapse. Montgomery was too practical for that. The objectives were to drive Soviet forces back to their pre-1939 borders, to liberate Poland and Czechoslovakia, and to impose, at gunpoint if necessary, the Atlantic Charter's promises of free elections and self-determination. The plan included detailed logistics, supply chain estimates, casualty projections. Montgomery calculated that the Allies would suffer approximately 100,000 casualties in the first 3 months. Soviet casualties would be far higher, potentially exceeding 1 million. The war would require total economic mobilization in Britain and America. Rationing would continue. Factories that had just begun converting to peacetime production would revert to war footing. And the political cost would be staggering. How could democratic governments ask their citizens to fight their recent ally, the nation whose sacrifices had been essential to defeating Hitler? Montgomery submitted Operation Unthinkable to Churchill on June 8, 1945. He included a cover memo that was as blunt as any document in military history. The plan, he wrote, was militarily feasible. Victory, however, was not guaranteed. The war would be longer, bloodier, and more uncertain than the one just concluded. And there was one additional complication Montgomery's team had identified. If the war turned against the Allies, if Soviet forces proved more resilient than expected, the West would face an existential crisis. Britain and America were democracies. Prolonged war without clear victory would erode public support, create political instability, and risk total collapse of the war effort. The Soviets, operating under a totalitarian system, had no such vulnerability. They could sustain losses indefinitely. Churchill read the plan in silence. He passed it to his senior advisors, who reacted with a mixture of horror and grim admiration. The plan was brilliant in its audacity and terrifying in its implications. Churchill, always the strategist, saw the logic. If Stalin intended to dominate Europe, and Churchill believed he did, then confronting him now, in 1945, while the West still held military superiority, was arguably the least costly option. Waiting would allow the Soviets to rebuild, to consolidate, to prepare. The price of hesitation might be paid for generations. But Churchill also understood political reality. Britain was exhausted. Its economy was in ruins. The British people had endured 6 years of war. Asking them to fight another, against an ally no less, was politically suicidal. And America, the only nation capable of sustaining such a war, was already pivoting toward Japan. The Pacific War was not yet over. Truman, who had just assumed the presidency after Roosevelt's death, was focused on ending the conflict with Japan as quickly as possible. Starting a war with the Soviets was unthinkable. On June 15, 1945, Churchill made his decision. Operation Unthinkable would remain filed, classified, forgotten. Britain would not start World War III. Instead, they would hope that diplomacy, economic pressure, and time would moderate Soviet ambitions. Churchill drafted a message to Montgomery, thanking him for his thoroughness and ordering the plan's immediate burial. Only a handful of people would ever know it existed. Montgomery received the order without emotion. He had done what was asked of him. He had provided the answer to the question. Can we fight them and win? His answer had been yes, but at a cost no democracy will pay. He filed the plan away, returned to his duties overseeing the occupation of Germany, and watched as the Iron Curtain descended exactly where he had predicted it would. 3 months later, as autumn turned to winter, the first signs of the coming Cold War became undeniable. In Poland, the Soviets arrested leaders of the non-communist resistance, men who had fought the Nazis alongside the Allies, and charged them with treason in show trials that were parodies of justice. In East Germany, entire factories were disassembled and shipped to the Soviet Union as war reparations, leaving German workers unemployed and starving. In the Baltic states, annexed by Stalin during the war, mass deportations began. Hundreds of thousands of Lithuanians, Latvians, and Estonians were herded onto freight trains and sent to labor camps in Siberia. Western leaders issued statements of concern. Diplomats filed protests. The Soviets ignored them. Montgomery, now overseeing the British occupation zone, filed report after report detailing Soviet abuses. He noted the patterns, the methods, the systematic nature of what was unfolding. This was not chaos or mismanagement. It was deliberate policy. Stalin was building an empire. In Washington, the Truman administration was slow to recognize the threat. Roosevelt had believed that personal diplomacy could manage Stalin, that shared victory over Hitler would create lasting cooperation. Truman inherited that optimism, but by early 1946, even he could not ignore the evidence. Churchill, no longer prime minister but still wielding immense moral authority, traveled to Fulton, Missouri, in March 1946. In a speech that would define the era, he declared that an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe. Behind it, freedom was dying. The speech shocked the world. Critics accused Churchill of warmongering, of betraying the alliance that had defeated Hitler. But within months, his words were vindicated. The Cold War had begun. Montgomery, now retired from active command, watched from the sidelines. In private correspondence, he expressed frustration but not surprise. He had seen this coming. He had drafted the plan to prevent it. And the West had chosen to wait, to hope, to believe that patience would be rewarded. Instead, the waiting had cost them the initiative. By 1948, the Soviets had solidified control over Eastern Europe. Czechoslovakia, the last semi-democratic state in the East, fell to a Soviet-backed coup. The Berlin blockade began, a test of Western resolve that brought the world to the edge of war. American planes airlifted supplies into West Berlin for nearly a year, avoiding direct confrontation but signaling that the West would not abandon the city. Montgomery gave a rare interview in 1949, after the Soviets detonated their first atomic bomb. Asked if he believed the Cold War could have been avoided, he paused, choosing his words carefully. "Wars are not avoided by wishing them away," he said. "They are avoided by making the cost of aggression too high to bear. We chose to hope instead of act. History will judge whether that was wisdom or folly." The judgment came in installments. Korea, 1950. American and Soviet-backed forces clashed in a proxy war that killed millions and ended in stalemate. Hungary, 1956. An uprising against Soviet rule was crushed by tanks while the West watched, paralyzed by fear of nuclear escalation. Vietnam, a grinding, decades-long conflict that tore America apart and achieved nothing. Afghanistan, where Soviet forces bogged down in a war of attrition that would eventually contribute to the USSR's collapse. Each conflict carried the fingerprints of the decision made in 1945. The decision to wait. The decision not to act. Montgomery died in 1976, long before the Berlin Wall fell. His funeral was attended by dignitaries from across the world, men who praised his strategic brilliance and battlefield victories. None mentioned Operation Unthinkable. The plan remained classified until the 1990s, released only after the Cold War's end, when its implications no longer threatened active policy. When historians finally read the document, reactions split along predictable lines. Some called it insane, a reckless gamble that would have started World War III. Others called it tragically prescient, a roadmap to preventing the Cold War before it began. What no one disputed was Montgomery's assessment of Soviet intentions. He had been correct. Stalin had no intention of allowing free elections or democratic governments in Eastern Europe. The Soviets had liberated those nations only to enslave them under a different system. The question that haunted analysts was not whether Montgomery had been right about the threat. It was whether his solution would have worked. Could the West have won a war against the Soviet Union in 1945? Militarily, most historians believe yes. The Red Army was exhausted, overextended, and vulnerable. The Allies held air superiority, better logistics, and a unified command structure. But wars are not won by military factors alone. They are won by political will, economic endurance, and societal cohesion. Would the American public, having just defeated Germany and Japan, support another war? Would Congress fund it? Would Britain, on the verge of bankruptcy, survive the economic strain? The unknowns were vast. And there was one additional factor that Montgomery's 1945 plan could not have anticipated. Nuclear weapons. By 1949, the Soviets had the bomb. By the 1950s, both sides possessed arsenals capable of annihilating humanity. If Operation Unthinkable had been launched and the war had dragged on, would it have gone nuclear? Would the first use of atomic weapons on the battlefield have escalated into mutual destruction? Montgomery's plan assumed a conventional war with clear objectives. History suggests such assumptions rarely survive contact with reality. Today, as strategists debate rising powers, contested regions, and the costs of preemption versus patience, Montgomery's ghost hovers over the conversation. His plan represents a road not taken, a fork in history that remains forever unexplored. Was it the path to a shorter, more decisive conflict that would have spared generations the terror of nuclear standoff and proxy wars? Or was it the path to Armageddon, a war that would have escalated beyond control and consumed the world in atomic fire? No one can answer that question. What remains is the image of a cautious, meticulous field marshal, a man who despised recklessness and romanticized nothing, sitting at a desk in June 1945, writing a plan to start the most dangerous war in human history. Not because he wanted it, but because he believed waiting would make the cost even higher. He was overruled. History unfolded without his plan. And the world lived under the shadow of nuclear annihilation for 44 years. On the night the Berlin Wall fell, as crowds celebrated in the streets and news anchors declared the triumph of freedom, a few historians opened dusty files and reread Operation Unthinkable. They wondered, as they always would, whether Montgomery had been a madman or a prophet. Whether the West's patience had been its greatest strength or its most tragic mistake. And whether the next time a rising power threatens the global order, the world will choose Montgomery's path or Eisenhower's, preemption or patience, the gamble of war now or the certainty of confrontation later. The question never dies. It only waits for the next crisis to ask it again.